Your solar panels are a clear violation of the homeowner agreement.
Yeah.
The board approved these plans months ago. Get off my property. Rules are rules.
My solar, my rules.
1. There are bad neighbors, and then there are people who treat power like it's their entire personality. And this story right here sits comfortably in that second category. Imagine finally saving enough money to build your dream home, choosing every detail carefully, making sure everything reflects years of hard work, only to have a group of self-appointed rule enforcers decide that your vision doesn't fit their idea of acceptable aesthetics. Now imagine that instead of backing down, you decide to play the game better than they ever could, and by the end of it, they're the ones begging for mercy. Bro, when I first heard this, I genuinely had to pause and think, because the level of calculated patience in this story is on another level. This all started in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, the kind of place where people wave at each other but secretly keep track of who trims their hedges too late. But behind the calm exterior was an HOA board that took their authority way too seriously. The kind of people who would measure grass height and like it was a competitive sport. And unfortunately for them, they picked the wrong homeowner to push around. Our main guy wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, and definitely wasn't the type to start drama, but he was something much more dangerous in these situations. Someone who reads the rules carefully and understands the system and knows exactly how to use it without breaking it. And when the HOA decided to block something that was completely legal, completely beneficial, and honestly just made sense in today's world, they probably thought it would end there. They assumed he would just comply like everyone else too. But instead, what followed was one of the most beautifully executed acts of malicious compliance I have ever come across. No shouting matches, no illegal moves, no over-the-top revenge schemes, just pure, strategic, perfectly legal payback that turned their own rules into their worst nightmare. And the craziest part is, every step he took was technically allowed. So by the time the HOA realized what was happening, it was already too late, because they weren't dealing with someone who wanted to win an argument. They were dealing with someone who wanted to win the system. And trust me, the way he did it was absolutely brilliant. 3. The neighborhood looked like something straight out of a brochure, the kind of place where every driveway was spotless, every lawn perfectly trimmed, and every house followed a near identical design pattern that screamed controlled perfection. From a distance, it felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like nothing ever went wrong there. But anyone who has ever lived under a strict homeowners association knows that behind that polished exterior, there's always a system quietly watching, regulating, and sometimes overstepping. Our main character had just moved into this neighborhood after years of planning, saving, and working toward a stable life. He wasn't someone who chased luxury for the sake of appearances, but he valued efficiency, long-term thinking, and making smart investments. That's exactly why one of the first upgrades he planned for his new home was installing solar panels. Not as a statement, not to stand out, but simply because it made sense financially and environmentally. And here's the thing that really matters. He didn't rush into it blindly. He checked local regulations, reviewed state laws, and even looked into HOA guidelines before making any decisions. Everything pointed in the same direction. Solar panels were allowed with some minor aesthetic considerations, nothing unusual and nothing unreasonable. So naturally, he moved forward with the installation process. At first, everything went smoothly. The paperwork was submitted, the design plans were clean and professional, and the placement of the panels was optimized for efficiency without being overly intrusive visually. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't disruptive, it was just practical. But this is where the story starts to shift, because while the rules technically allowed solar panels, the HOA board had its own interpretation of what acceptable meant, and that interpretation was about to become a problem. For a few days after submitting his request, he received a response that didn't sit right. The HOA wasn't outright denying solar panels, but they were raising concerns about visual uniformity and community. aesthetic consistency. Now, if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you already know what that usually translates to. They're not saying no directly, but they're making it as difficult as possible. Bro, hearing this part honestly made me shake my head because this is exactly how these situations escalate in real life. It's never a clean rejection, it's always layers of vague language that give them room to push back without clearly breaking. Any rules? Instead of reacting emotionally, he did something most people don't do. He slowed down and started reading everything more carefully. Not just the basic HOA guidelines, but the fine print, the amendments, the legal protections that homeowners often overlook. And what he found was interesting. There were specific clauses protecting homeowners' rights to install energy efficient systems, especially solar panels. These clauses weren't just suggestions, they were backed by state level regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of obstruction. So at this point, he had two options. He could either push back directly and risk a long, frustrating dispute, or he could take a different approach, one that didn't involve confrontation at all. And this is where his mindset really sets the tone for everything that follows. Instead of arguing, instead of trying to win against the HOA, he decided to comply, at least on the surface. He adjusted his plans slightly, resubmitted them, and made sure everything aligned as closely as possible with the HOA's vague aesthetic concerns. From the outside, it looked like he was backing down, like he was just another homeowner falling in line with the system, but internally he was already thinking several steps ahead. 5. Because while the HOA was focused on controlling appearances, he was focused on understanding limitations and, more importantly, loopholes. And let me tell you, this is where things start getting interesting, because once you understand the exact boundaries of a system, you don't need to break the rules to completely change the outcome, and you just need to follow them perfectly. Weeks passed and the situation seemed to settle on the surface, and the HOA felt like they had established control, like they had successfully enforced their standards. But what they didn't realize was that in trying to restrict one solution, they had unintentionally opened the door to something much bigger, something they never saw coming. And by the time they would notice it, the entire balance of control in that neighborhood would shift, because sometimes the smartest way to fight authority isn't to resist it, is to agree with it so precisely that it collapses under its own logic. And that's exactly what he was about to do. On the surface, everything looked resolved. The paperwork had been revised, the HOA had responded with what they believed was a firm but reasonable stance, and the neighborhood went back to its usual rhythm of quiet routines and subtle judgment. And if anyone had been watching from the outside, they would have assumed the situation had ended exactly the way these things usually do, with the homeowner adjusting their plans just enough to satisfy the board and avoid conflict. But that assumption couldn't have been further from the truth, because while the HOA members were busy feeling like they had preserved their precious visual harmony, our guy was deep into a different kind of process entirely. He wasn't thinking about how to get approval anymore. He was thinking about energy, angles, surfaces, and more importantly, how to stay completely within the rules while achieving the exact same end result they had tried to block. 6. And this is where things start to get a little technical, but in a way that makes the entire situation even more impressive. Instead of focusing on rooftop solar panels, he started researching ground level reflective solutions, not solar panels themselves, but surfaces that could redirect sunlight efficiently. At first glance, this might sound like a random pivot, but when you really think about it, it's actually brilliant. If you can't place something directly where you want it, you change how the environment interacts with it. Bro, this is the part that genuinely blew my mind, because this wasn't emotional revenge, this was strategic engineering disguised as compliance. He carefully studied the HOA guidelines again, not just the sections about solar panels, but everything related to landscaping, outdoor fixtures, decorative elements, and property modifications. And what he found was exactly what he needed. The rules were incredibly strict when it came to rooftops and visible installations that altered the uniform appearance of homes, but when it came to ground level features like garden installations or decorative structures, the language became noticeably more flexible. Their guidelines, sure, but they were far less restrictive, mostly focused on height limits, placement boundaries, and general safety considerations. Nothing in those rules explicitly prohibited reflective materials. And that's when the idea started to take shape. At first, it was just a concept, something theoretical, but the more he explored it, the more viable it became. Reflective panels, positioned correctly, could redirect sunlight toward a specific area. Not only that, but they could do it efficiently enough to compensate for the lack of rooftop panels. But here's the real twist, and this is where the story shifts from clever to absolutely savage. Those reflective surfaces wouldn't just interact with sunlight in isolation, they would also interact with everything around them. 7. Including the HOA board members' houses. Now, before you jump to conclusions, this wasn't about creating chaos or causing harm. Everything he planned was completely within legal and regulatory limits. The reflections wouldn't be dangerous. They wouldn't damage property and they wouldn't violate any specific rule, but they would be noticeable, very noticeable, and more importantly, unavoidable. So he started planning, not impulsively, not carelessly, but with the same level of precision he had used when designing his original solar setup. He mapped out the angles of sunlight throughout the day and observed how shadows moved across the neighborhood and identified the exact positions where reflective surfaces would be most effective. And slowly, piece by piece, the plan became reality. The first installation didn't attract much attention. It looked like a decorative feature, a sleek, modern reflective panel positioned in the yard. It wasn't large enough to raise concerns, and it didn't violate any visible guidelines. In fact, it almost looked like an intentional design choice, something meant to add a contemporary touch to the property. But then came the second one, and the third, and the fourth, each one placed with purpose, each one aligned with a specific angle, each one contributing to a larger system that only he fully understood at that point. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like an unusual landscaping trend, but to someone paying closer attention, it was clear that something more deliberate was happening. Neighbors started to notice. At first, it was subtle, a comment here, a glance there. People weren't sure what to make of it. It wasn't breaking any rules, it wasn't loud or disruptive, but it was definitely different. And in a neighborhood that thrived on uniformity, different was enough to create tension. Meanwhile, the HOA board remained unaware of the full picture. 8. They had already mentally closed the case, assuming that their earlier pushback had done its job. They weren't monitoring the situation closely anymore because, as far as they were concerned, the issue had been resolved. And that's exactly why what happened next caught them completely off guard. As the number of reflective panels increased, so did their impact. Sunlight, instead of dispersing naturally, began concentrating in specific directions during certain times of the day. Beams of reflected light would hit nearby houses, not intensely enough to cause harm, but enough to create a noticeable glare. And guess which houses were most affected? That's right, the homes of the HOA board members themselves. Bro, when this realization hit them, it must have been insane because suddenly the very system they had used to control someone else's property was now being used against them without a single rule being broken. At first, they probably thought it was a coincidence, maybe just an unfortunate alignment of sunlight. But as days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The reflections weren't random, they were consistent, precise, and clearly intentional in their placement, and yet completely compliant. This is exactly how people act in real life when they think authority gives them absolute control. They enforce rules without considering how those same rules can be applied in reverse. And when that reversal happens, they're completely unprepared for it. By the time the HOA started to look into the situation again, the setup had already expanded far beyond what they could easily address. There weren't just a few reflective surfaces anymore. There were dozens, each one positioned in a way that made removing or restricting them extremely complicated without rewriting entire sections of their own guidelines. And even if they attempted to do that, it wouldn't be immediate. It would require meetings, approvals, and legal considerations. 9. In other words, time. And during that time, the reflections continued day after day, angle after angle, turning what was once a quiet, controlled neighborhood into a subtle but persistent reminder that control only works when it's applied fairly. And this is where the tension really peaks, because now the HOA isn't just dealing with the homeowner anymore, they're dealing with the consequences of their own system. And they're about to realize just how difficult it is to undo something that was built perfectly within the rules. By the time the HOA board fully understood what was happening, the situation had already slipped beyond their immediate control. What had started as a few reflective panels had now evolved into a carefully engineered layout that interacted with sunlight in ways they had never anticipated. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't random, and that's exactly what made it so difficult to challenge. It was intentional, and more importantly, it was compliant. At first, they tried to handle it quietly. Internal discussions, informal observations, even a few discreet visits to the property to assess the situation. But every time they looked for a clear violation, they came up empty. The panels weren't exceeding height limits, they weren't encroaching on property lines, and they weren't classified under any restricted category within the HOA guidelines. Bro, this is where things get really interesting because you could almost feel the frustration building on their side. They had spent so much time enforcing rules on others, but now they were facing someone who understood those rules better than they did. And that's a dangerous position to be in. Eventually, they decided to take a more direct approach. A formal notice was sent and raising concerns about light disturbances and potential nuisance factors. But even in that notice, the language was cautious, almost hesitant, because they knew they were stepping into uncertain territory. 10. They couldn't outright accuse him of violating rules that didn't exist. And when he responded, he did exactly what he had been doing from the beginning, and he complied, not by removing anything, not by apologizing, but by addressing every single point in their notice with calm, structured explanations. He referenced the exact sections of the HOA guidelines, pointed out the absence of restrictions on reflective materials, and even included documentation showing that the light levels produced by the panels were within acceptable environmental standards. That response alone shifted the dynamic because now this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a documented exchange where one side was relying on vague interpretations and the other was backed by precise, verifiable information. This is exactly how people act in real life when they think they can rely on authority alone. It works until someone challenges them with facts, and that's exactly what was happening here. The HOA wasn't used to being challenged like this. Most homeowners either complied immediately or pushed back emotionally, which made it easier to dismiss their concerns. But this situation was different. There was no emotional argument to shut down, no clear violation to enforce, just a perfectly constructed scenario that exposed the limits of their own authority. So they escalated, meetings were called, and discussions became more intense. Some board members started pushing for emergency amendments to the guidelines, trying to introduce restrictions on reflective surfaces. But even that wasn't simple. Whole rules couldn't just be changed overnight. They required proper procedures, votes, and in some cases, approval from the community. And here's where the pressure really started to shift. Because now the issue wasn't just affecting one homeowner. The reflections, while harmless, were noticeable enough that other residents had started paying attention. 11. Some were curious, some were amused, and some were quietly supportive. Why? Because for the first time, someone had found a way to push back without breaking the rules. Bro, hearing this part honestly felt like watching a slow-motion domino effect. One decision by the HOA had triggered a chain reaction they couldn't stop. As the days went on, the reflections became more strategic, not stronger. not harmful but more precise. During certain hours, sunlight would reflect directly towards specific windows, creating a glare that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't constant, but it was consistent enough to become a daily inconvenience. And guess who was feeling it the most? The same HOA board members who had initially blocked the solar panels. Now, let's be clear, this wasn't harassment. It wasn't targeting in a legal sense. The panels were positioned within his property and aligned based on natural sunlight angles. Any impact beyond that was simply a result of physics, and that's what made it untouchable. The HOA tried to argue that it was intentional, but proving intent without breaking any rules is incredibly difficult. You can punish someone for understanding how light works. At this point, frustration turned into urgency. Another notice was sent, this time more strongly worded, hinting at potential community disruption, but again it lacked a solid foundation. And when he responded, he did something that completely flipped the situation. He invited them to a formal review, not a confrontation, not an argument, but a structured discussion where everything would be laid out clearly, documentation, measurements, guidelines, everything. And they agreed, probably thinking they could regain control of the situation. But what they walked into was something very different. The review wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive, it was methodical. He presented his original solar panel proposal, the one they had effectively blocked to aesthetic concerns. 12 then, he showed the current setup, explaining how each reflective panel complied with existing guidelines. Step by step, he demonstrated that every action he had taken was a direct result of their initial decision. Bro, this is the moment where everything clicks. This wasn't just revenge, this was accountability. He didn't need to accuse them of anything, he didn't need to raise his voice. The entire situation spoke for itself. By blocking a straightforward, efficient solution, they had forced a more complex alternative, one that technically followed their rules but created outcomes they didn't like. And now they were experiencing those outcomes firsthand. This is exactly how systems break down when they're built on control rather than logic. They work fine until someone applies them in a way that exposes their flaws. The room, or whatever setting they used for that review, must have felt completely different by the end of it. The HOA board wasn't dealing with a problem they could simply enforce away anymore. They were dealing with the consequences of their own framework, and for the first time, they were the ones at a disadvantage. Because any attempt to force changes now would raise questions not just from him, but from other residents who had started to see what was really happening. So they had a choice: double down and risk losing credibility, or find a way to resolve the situation without admitting fault. And that decision would define everything that came next. Bro, hearing this entire situation from start to finish genuinely felt like watching a masterclass in patience and strategy. And the crazy part is, nothing about this was extreme. There were no threats, no illegal moves, no dramatic confrontations. Just a clear understanding of how systems work and how they can be navigated. That's exactly how people act in real life when they actually take the time to understand rules instead of just reacting to them. 13. Because let's be honest, most HOA stories go one of two ways. Either the homeowner gives up and complies completely, or they fight back emotionally and end up making things worse for themselves. But this was different. This was someone choosing a third option, one that most people don't even consider. Instead of asking, how do I win against them? He asked, how do I work within the system better than they do? And that mindset changes everything. One of the biggest takeaways here is that rules are only as powerful as your understanding of them. And a lot of organizations, not just HOAs, rely on the assumption that people won't read the fine print. They expect compliance, not analysis. So the moment someone actually takes the time to go through everything carefully to understand not just what's written but what's missing, the entire dynamic shifts. And that's exactly what happened here. Another thing that really stands out is the idea of proportional response. He didn't go overboard. He didn't try to destroy the system or create unnecessary conflict. Everything he did was measured, controlled, and reversible. And that's important because it gave him credibility. This is something a lot of people overlook. If your response is too aggressive, you lose the moral high ground. But if it's precise and justified, people start to see your side even if they weren't involved initially. And you could see that happening in the neighborhood. Other residents weren't just watching, they were learning. They saw that it was possible to stand up for yourself without breaking rules, without escalating into chaos. That's a powerful message. Also, let's talk about the HOA side for a second, because as frustrating as their actions were, this situation also highlights something important about authority. Systems like HOAs exist for a reason. They're meant to maintain order, protect property values, and create consistency. 14. But the problem starts when those systems prioritize control over logic. And that's exactly what happened here. They weren't wrong to have guidelines, but they were wrong to apply them in a way that ignored practicality. Blocking solar panels for aesthetic reasons in today's world just doesn't make sense. And instead of adapting, they doubled down until they couldn't, and that's why the resolution worked. Not because one side won, but because the system corrected itself. The HOA adjusted its approach, and the homeowner got a fair outcome, and the neighborhood moved forward with a better understanding of how things should be handled. And honestly, that's the best kind of outcome you can hope for in situations like this. And just like that, what started as a simple HOA dispute turned into one of the cleanest examples of smart, legal, and absolutely satisfying malicious compliance you'll ever hear about. No chaos, no over-the-top drama, just pure strategy playing out exactly the way it should. Bro, stories like this are honestly why I always say never underestimate someone who stays calm while everyone else is getting emotional, because the moment you stop reacting and start thinking, you're already playing at a completely different level. And that's exactly what happened here. The HOA thought they were enforcing control, but instead they ended up exposing the limits of their own system. And the homeowner, he didn't just solve his problem, he changed how that entire community would approach situations like, and this moving forward, that was incredible. So if you take anything away from this story, let it be this: always know your rights, always read the fine print, and never assume that the first no you hear is the final answer. Sometimes the best move isn't to fight harder, it's to think smarter, because when you do that, you don't just win the situation, you redefine it. And 15. Now I'm curious, have you ever dealt with something like this? Maybe not an HOA, but any situation where rules were used against you unfairly. Drop your story in the comments, because honestly, these real life experiences are always the most interesting to hear. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more stories like this. And there's a lot more out there, and trust me, some of them get even crazier than this. Until next time, stay smart, stay patient, and maybe double check those HOA rules before you sign anything.